The young man kicked the old motorcycle over, and it went down on the gravel with a sound like a church bell cracking. A can of beer followed it. He shook the last of it out across the silver tank, the foam running down into the seams of metal that had been hand-shaped before he was born. And he turned to the cameras his friend was holding and grinned. Because the grin was the product. The grin was what paid his rent. Keanu Reeves did not say anything at first. He was 60 years old in a faded gray jacket and boots worn pale at the toe, and he had been standing by the rail of the roadhouse with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand. And now he set the cup down on the rail, slowly, and walked over, and crouched, and lifted the bike back upright, the way you help someone up who has fallen, with both hands and no hurry. He wiped the beer off the tank with his sleeve. Then he laid his open palm flat against the engine case, the way a man lays a hand on the flank of a horse, and he listened to it with his hand the way other men listen with their ears. What the young man at the center of the laughing crowd did not know was that those same hands had drawn the engine inside his own motorcycle, the one he had just bragged about, and that in a little under 4 hours, a vote 3 counties away was going to decide the fate of the name half the people in that parking lot had tattooed on their arms. The old man stood up. He looked at the young man the way you look at a storm you have seen before. He said a few quiet words, and he walked back to his coffee. But to understand how a few quiet words could bring down a brand, you have to go back to that morning, before any of it, to 7 o'clock and an empty mountain road. The Angeles Crest highway climbs out of the basin and into the San Gabriel Mountains in a long series of curves that motorcyclists have loved and feared for 100 years. And near the top of it, in a flat spot of cleared pine above the town of Wrightwood, sat a low building of weathered board, called the Ridgeline Roadhouse. It had been there in one form or another since before the road was paved, and it had burned twice and been rebuilt twice, and it served coffee and eggs and, on weekends, a kind of religion to the riders who came up the mountain to be among their own kind. Keanu liked to arrive before they did, when the lot was empty and the light was just coming over the ridge, because the mountain in the early morning still belonged to the road and not to the crowd. He came up the grade on a motorcycle that no one would have looked at twice. It was old. The paint had gone from silver to the color of a winter sky, and there was no badge on the tank, no maker's mark. Nothing to tell you what it was or who had made it. It made a sound, though, that anyone who knew engines would have stopped to hear, a low, even beat with no waver in it. The sound of a machine that has been built by a hand that cared and maintained by the same hand for 30 years. He shut it off in the empty lot and sat for a moment in the quiet, listening to the metal tick as it cooled, and then he went inside, where Loretta Hale had the coffee on. He could have ridden anything. That was the thing people would not have guessed, looking at the unbadged old bike. He could have ridden the newest machine the company made, the most expensive one, the kind that men paid 2 years of wages to own and waited a year to receive. He had built the engines in all of them. But he rode the first one, the prototype, the one with the winter sky paint. And he rode it not out of poverty and not out of nostalgia exactly, but out of something he could not have explained to anyone except Gray, which was that it was the only one of all of them that was still exactly itself, that had not been improved or refined or optimized, that carried in its slightly wrong balance and its hand-filed imperfections the actual record of 2 young men learning how to make the thing as they made it. Every other Iron Veil was better than this one. This one was true. And there is a difference between better and true that a man spends his whole life learning, and most never learn it at all. And the ones who do are usually alone with the knowledge, the way Keanu was alone with it on the empty road in the early light, riding the worst motorcycle his company had ever made because it was the only honest one. "You're early, even for you," Loretta said. She was 71 years old, and she had run the Ridgeline for 40 of them, since her husband had gone off the outside of a curve on the lower mountain in 1986 and not come back. And she had kept the place not out of love for it, exactly because to close it would have been to let the road win, and Loretta Hale did not let things win. She poured his coffee without being asked. Black, no sugar, hot enough to be a small punishment. "The road's better empty," Keanu said. "Everything's better empty," said Loretta. "That's why I run a business full of people. I like to suffer." Behind the counter, on the long wall, was the thing that made the ridgeline more than a roadhouse, which was the photographs. 40 years of them, riders and machines, the famous and the forgotten, the living and a great many of the dead, because the road took its toll, and Loretta kept the faces of the ones it took. Keanu had stood in front of that wall many mornings. There was a picture, low and to the left, half hidden by a newer one, of two young men in front of a bare engine on a workbench. Both of them grinning, one of them him at 30, and the other a broad-shouldered man named Gray Donovan. And the date under it was a year that felt to Keanu now like a story someone had told him about himself, rather than a thing he had lived. Loretta had a rule about the wall, which she had never written down and never needed to, which was that a face went up when the road took it and never came down, no matter who needed the space, no matter how long ago. Because the whole point of the wall, she said, was that the mountain did not get to decide who was forgotten. She decided. The riders who came up on weekends did not always understand the wall. Some of them thought it was morbid, all those faces of the dead behind the eggs and the coffee. But the ones who had ridden long enough understood that it was the opposite of morbid, that it was the most honest thing in the building, that a road which could take you deserved a wall, that remembered you, and that there was a kind of courage in eating your breakfast every weekend under the gaze of the people the road had already taken. Loretta had put her own husband up there in 1986, second row, third from the left. A man on a motorcycle squinting into a sun that had been setting for almost 40 years now, and she had never once moved him, and she did not talk about him, and the not talking was its own kind of monument. "You looked at it again," Loretta said. She had come up beside him with the pot. "I look at all of them. You look at that one." He did not answer that, and Loretta did not push it, because she was a woman who understood that there are 12 people you do not open just because you have the handle, and she went back to the griddle, and the morning went on. The boy came at 7:40. His name was Cole Bishop. He was 19 years old, and he washed dishes and abused tables at the Ridgeline money, and hung around it the rest of the time for reasons he could not have explained, which were that the road and the machines and the men who rode them seemed to him the only thing in his small life that was larger than his small life. He had a motorcycle of his own that he had bought for $400 and rebuilt 3 times, badly. And he had a dream he had told no one, which was that he wanted to build engines, to design them, to make the thing that made the machine go. And he had no idea how a person from a town like his got from here to there, or whether there even was a way anymore. He had found Keanu the year before, in this same lot, watching the old man diagnose a stranger's failed bike by ear, by sound alone, without ever taking a panel off, and at the end of it Cole had asked the only question that mattered, which was, "How did you know it was the timing and not the fuel?" And Keanu had looked at him for a long moment with an expression Cole could not read, and had said, "Because the fuel makes one kind of wrong and the timing makes another. And the difference is in the sound. And most people stopped listening a long time ago." And he had begun, on the mornings when no one else was around, to teach the boy how to listen. "Bring it over," Keanu said now, and Cole brought him the part he had been struggling with, a worn rocker arm off his own bike, and they bent over it together at the rail in the early light, and for a few minutes the most important thing happening on that whole mountain was a teenager learning the difference between where that you could live with and where that would kill you on a curve. This is a thing about a craft that is dying, and it is the thing that the people who let it die never understand. It does not die in a board meeting. It dies one unasked question at a time, on empty mornings, and it is kept alive, if it is kept alive at all, exactly the same way. "Why does it wear there and not there?" Cole asked, turning the arm in the light, and Keanu did not answer the way a book would answer. He took the part and held it so the boy could see the bright gold place along one edge, and he said, "Because of what kind of engine it came off of." A V-twin like yours, the two cylinders share a crank pin, and that's the whole beauty and the whole problem of it. It's why it sounds the way it sounds, that lope, that heartbeat, instead of the sewing machine hum of the fours. Two pistons fighting over the same pin, never quite balanced, and you can feel it. You can feel the whole machine breathe. But the price of that sound is load. Right here. And that's where it wears. And a man who built engines to be quiet, and even would tell you that lope is a defect. He'd be right on paper and wrong about everything that matters. He handed the arm back. Most of the things worth doing are defects on paper. He had spent his life on that defect. There had been a time in the early years when the engineers from the big factories had told the two young men in the rented garage that the thing they were trying to build was a mistake, that the market wanted smooth and cheap and reliable, that there was no money in a heavy hand-built twin that loped and shook and demanded to be felt. And the engineers had been right about the money for a long time, right up until they were wrong, until it turned out that there were enough people in the world who wanted to feel the thing they rode that a small company could live on it, if it was willing to stay small, if it was willing to build each one slowly. Out of metal poured and cooled and machined and trued by people who could hear the difference. Keanu had cast the first cases himself, in a process so old it embarrassed the modern world. A foam pattern buried in sand, and the molten aluminum poured in to burn the foam away and take its exact shape, a method a sculptor would recognize sooner than an engineer. And he had stood over the first pour with Gray and watched the metal find the form of the thing they had only drawn, and that, he had thought at the time, was as close as a man like him was ever going to get to making something out of nothing. What Cole did not know, what almost no one on that mountain knew, was what the old man's hands had made. In the early years, in a rented garage down in the basin, two young men named Keanu Reeves and Gray Donovan had set out to build a motorcycle engine that did a thing the big factories had decided was not worth doing, which was to be built by people instead of by machines. Slowly, each one trued by hand, a V-twin of a particular balance and a particular sound that you could not get from a part that came out of a mold by the thousand. It had taken them years, and most of their money and all of their 20s, and the thing they finally built was so good that it did not a secret. Riders heard it. Riders are people who have learned to hear, and the sound of that engine traveled the way only a true thing travels, by word of mouth among people who know, and the rented garage became a small company, and the small company became a name, Iron Vale Cycle Works, and the name became the kind of thing that men with money eventually come to look at. Gray Donovan had been the loud half of the two of them, which is the part Keanu never told anyone, because people assumed, looking at the quiet old man, that he had always been the quiet old man. And the truth was that Gray had done the talking for both them 20 years, and Keanu had let him, gladly, because it freed him to do the thing he loved, which was the metal. Gray was the one who walked into the dealerships with no money and talked them into floor space. Gray was the one who stood up at the rallies and told the story of the two kids in the garage until the story became true by being told. Gray could not machine a case to save his life, and he knew it, and he never pretended otherwise. And that was the thing about him, that he knew exactly what he was, and exactly what Keanu was, and never once confused the two, or let the world confuse them. Both of us, or neither of us. He had said it about the cast mark, and he had meant it about everything. When the first investors came, it was Gray, who read the contracts at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a pencil, circling the words that would matter in 20 years, saying, "They always want the thing your hands can't make, Eli. Watch for the clause about the thing your hands can't make." And it was Gray who had put into the founders' agreement, over the lawyers' objections, the provision that the core design could not be sent away from the founders' own hands without a vote so high that no one could reach it without one of them agreeing. The lawyers had called it sentimental. Gray had called it Tuesday. It was the clause, 30 years later, that was going to save 40 jobs, written by a dead man at a kitchen table because he had been able to see, even then, Exactly the kind of afternoon that was coming. The engine had a number cast into the case of the very first one ever built. The prototype, the one Keanu still rode 30 years later up the Angeles Crest on empty mornings. It said 001. And beside the number, small, where you would only find it if you knew to look, were two sets of initials joined into a single mark, because Gray Donovan had insisted on it, had stood in the garage, with the casting sand still on his hands, and said, "Both of us or neither of us. That's the deal. That's always been the deal." And so the mark on the first engine, and on every engine after it, carried them both. Gray had died 11 years ago, not on the road. In a hospital, slowly, of the thing that takes the body a piece at a time, and Keanu had sat with him at the end, and Gray had made him promise something, and Keanu had promised, and then he had spent 11 years quietly, not keeping the promises, which is the part of this that he is least proud of and the part you should hold on to. Because a man who tells you his hero never failed is selling you something. What Gray had said near the end was this. They had taken money by then, investment, to grow the company, the way you have to. And Gray had seen even from his hospital bed that the men who bring money also bring their idea of what a thing is for, and he had said, "Don't let them turn it into a logo, Eli. The day this becomes a name they print on a thing made somewhere cheap, it stops being what we built. Promise me you'll be in the room. Promise me you won't disappear into that garage of yours, and let them sell the soul of it while you're busy keeping your hands clean." And Keanu had promised. And then Gray had died, and the grief had done to Keanu what grief does to a certain kind of private man, which is that it had made the workshop and the empty road, and the solitude more precious, and the boardroom, and the people, and the fight less bearable. And year by year he had pulled back, kept his founder's shares, but stopped coming to the meetings, kept building the prototypes he loved, but stopped guarding the thing he had built, until Ironvale Cycle Works had a chief executive he had met twice, and a board he did not know, and a direction he did not like, and had told himself each year that he would deal with it next year. This year, it turned out, was next year. He just did not know it yet that morning, with the boy's rocker arm in his hand and the light coming over the ridge. 3 counties away, in a glass office down in the basin, a man named Spencer Loomis was getting ready to win. Spencer Loomis worked for a fund called Crestline Capital, and Crestline Capital had spent 2 years quietly buying its way onto the board of Ironvale Cycle Works. And at 4 o'clock that afternoon, the board was going to vote on a proposal that Spencer Loomis had built with great care, which was to license the Ironvale name and the Ironvale engine design to a manufacturing partner overseas, to move production out of the small California shops, where each machine was still built by hand, and to turn a beloved, difficult, unprofitable maker of real things into a profitable printer of a logo. The numbers were good. The numbers were, in fact, excellent, and Spencer Loomis was not a villain in his own mind. He was a man who solved problems, and the problem of Ironvale was that it made too few motorcycles too well to ever make anyone truly rich. And Spencer Loomis had been hired to fix exactly that kind of problem. He had the votes. He had counted them 3 times. The only piece of the thing that had ever worried him was a block of founders' shares held by a man who never came to meetings, a recluse, an engineer, somebody named Reeves who had not cast a vote in 11 years and was, by every account, more interested in his workshop than in his company. A man like that, Spencer Loomis had reasoned, would not show up now. Men like that never showed up. That was what made them men like that. It is worth being fair to Spencer Loomis, because the story is truer if he is not a cartoon. He had a wife who was sick and bills that frightened even him, and he had been told by people he trusted that sentiment was the thing that killed companies, that the old slow, careful ways were a kind of vanity that the workers and the customers ultimately paid food for, and he believed it, mostly, the way we all believe the thing that lets us keep doing what we are already doing. He was going to do real harm that afternoon, to a real trade, to real people who built things with their hands. And he was going to do it sincerely. And that is a more frightening kind of person than a villain. and the world is full of them. The crowd came up the mountain through the late morning the way it always did on a clear Saturday, and by noon the lot of the ridgeline was full of machines, and the air smelled of exhaust and coffee and pine. And Loretta was working the griddle hard, and Cole was running plates, and Keanu had moved to a bench at the edge of the bike and out of the press of people, which is where he was when Brock Halsey rode in. Blown out of Brock Osri. One of the riders who had come up that morning was a woman named Dolores Aquino, 58 years old, who rode an iron veil she had bought, used and loved past reason, and who had stopped at Keanu's bench an hour earlier, not knowing who he was, only because he had the look of a man who knew engines, to ask about a noise hers had started making on the climb. He had listened to it for 30 seconds with his head tilted and told her it was a loose primary chain, nothing that would strand her. A half hour with the right tools, and she had thanked him, and they had talked a little the way riders do, and she had told him, without knowing she was telling the one man who could save it, that she built the cases for these engines for a living. She worked at one of the small shops down in the basin, 40 of them all told across 3 buildings, and they were good jobs, the kind getting hard to find, where you made a real thing with your hands and could point to it on the road. And she had heard a rumor lately that frightened her, that something was coming, that the suits meant to send the work overseas, and keep only the name. I keep telling myself the founders wouldn't let that happen, Dolores Aquino had said, to a stranger on a bench, about himself. One died, they say. The other one, nobody ever sees. But you'd think a man who built a thing like this with his own hands wouldn't let them grind it up for parts. You'd think he'd show up. Then she had gone to find her friends. The rumor in her chest was true, and the man who was supposed to show up was sitting on the bench she had walked away from. And he had been the kind of man who did not show up for 11 years. Brock Halsey was 34 years old, and he made his living, such as it was, with a camera. He had a following, the modern kind, built on a particular character he played, a loud, confident man who said the things other men were afraid to say, and lately the thing that had been getting him the most attention was a series of videos in which he found older riders on older machines and mocked them, gently, at first, and then not gently, because the numbers had taught him that cruelty traveled faster than kindness, that the clip of him humiliating someone got 10 times the views of the clip of him being decent, and a man will become whatever the numbers reward him for being if he does it long enough and needs the money badly enough. And Brock Halsey needed the money badly. This is the part you should hold on to. His following had plateaued. His sponsors were nervous. And he had, 3 months earlier, signed a contract that he believed was going to save him. A brand ambassadorship. A deal to be the young, loud face of a heritage motorcycle company that wanted to reach a younger, louder audience. A company called Iron Veil Cycle Works. The very engine in the very expensive motorcycle he rode into the Ridgeline lot that afternoon. The machine he had been given as part of the deal. The machine he was about to brag about to his camera had been designed by the old man sitting on the bench by the rail. He did not know that. He could not have known that. He saw, when his eyes swept the lot for content, an old man in a faded jacket beside a beat-up, unbadged motorcycle the color of a winter sky, and he saw in that a thing the numbers had taught him to see, which was an opportunity. "Oh, this is perfect," Brock said to his friend with the camera. "Get this! Get this guy!" What happened next happened fast, and a great many people saw it, and within a few hours a great many more would see it, because there were, by the time it was over, not 1 camera recording but 9. Brock walked over to the bench with the swagger that was his whole career, and he stood over Keanu, and he gestured at the old bike with the back of his hand the way you gesture at trash. "What is this thing, my man?" he said, loud, for the camera. "No badge, no paint, sounds like a coffee can full of bolts. You build this in your garage? This a kit bike? Tell me this isn't a kit bike." He was grinning. The crowd nearby had started to turn the way crowds do, drawn to the smell of a thing about to happen. "I'm just saying, some of us ride the real thing." He patted the tank of his own gleaming machine. "And some of us ride whatever this is." Keanu looked up at him. He had a way of looking up that took its time. That did not hurry to meet a loud voice, and to a man who needed to be feared it reads as insolence, though it is the opposite. It is a man whose attention belongs to no one but himself. "It runs," Keanu said. That was all. And the not rising to it, the refusal to be afraid or angry or to perform for the camera, did to Brock Halsey what it does to men like him, which is that it took away the only thing he knew how to use. He had a whole act built on the other person getting upset, on the flush of anger, the raised voice, the moment the target made themselves ridiculous trying to defend their dignity, because that moment was the product. That was the thing the numbers paid for. An old man who simply said it runs and went back to his coffee was a kind of silence he did not know how to fill. And here is the thing that was happening inside Brock Halsey in that second. The thing that explains it without excusing it. He could feel the crowd's attention which had swung to him when he started, beginning to swing back, beginning to curdle, because a crowd that gathers to watch a man be cruel will turn on him the instant. The cruelty stops being entertaining and starts being just cruelty. And Brock had spent enough years reading crowds to feel that exact turn beginning. The laughter going thin, the first few faces going uncomfortable. He was losing them. And a man who has built his whole self on not losing them, who needs them the way other men need air, will do something larger to get them back, will escalate past the line he would never have crossed cold, because the alternative, the flat dead moment of a bit that did not land, is the one thing he cannot survive. So he reached for the only tool he had left. He kicked the bike over. It was not a large motion. That is the thing the people who were there remembered, that it was almost casual, the toe of an expensive boot against the old machine. And 30 years of perfect balance went down onto the gravel with that cracked bell sound, and the crowd made a noise. And Brock, riding the noise, grabbed a half-finished can of beer off the rail and shook it out over the silver tank, the foam running down into the hand-shaped seams, and turned to the camera and grinned. Because the grin was the product. The lot went quiet in the particular way a place goes quiet when something has happened that everyone knows was wrong. And no one knows what to do about. Cole Bishop had come out onto the porch with a stack of plates and stood frozen with them in his hands. Loretta Hale had come to the door of the roadhouse, a spatula still in her grip and a look on her face like weather coming over the ridge. And Keanu Reeves did not shout. He set his coffee cup down on the rail, slowly. He stood. He walked over to the fallen motorcycle and he crouched beside it, and he lifted it upright with both hands and no hurry, the way you help up someone who has fallen. He wiped the beer off the tank with his sleeve, patiently, getting it out of the seams, because beer left on metal will do damage over time. And Keanu had never in his life let a thing be damaged that he could prevent. And then he did the thing that the 9 cameras caught, and that would, in the end, mean more than any of it, which was that he laid his open palm flat against the engine case and held it there a moment, the way a man lays a hand on the flank of a horse that has been frightened, and his thumb moved, just slightly, across a place on the case where, if you knew to look, there was a number and a joined mark cast into the metal. He was checking that it was still there. The 001, the 2 sets of initials, Gray's insistence, 30 years old. He was checking that the careless boot had not cracked, the one part of the machine that could not be replaced, which was not any part you could buy, but the proof of where it came from and whose hands had begun it. It had not. The mark was whole. Keanu stood. He looked at Brock Halsey, and he did not look at him with hatred, which would have given the younger man something to push against, and he did not look at him with fear, which would have given him what he came for. He looked at him the way you look at a sky that is going to do a thing you have watched it do before. "You should look at what's cast into the case," Keanu said, "before you put any more of this on the internet." A few quiet words. He picked up his coffee, which had gone cold, and he carried it back to his bench, and he sat down, and the crowd stood in the strange, flat silence of people who have just watched a powerful young man win something he is going to wish he had lost. It was 12 minutes past noon. The board would vote at 4. and the only block of shares that could stop them was sitting on a bench with a cold cup of coffee, drawing no attention to itself at all. For a while, nothing happened, which is how these things go. Brock Halsey told himself he had gotten his clip, that the old man was nobody, that nobody was somebody you could build content on, and he and his friend got back on their machines, and the loud one's machine made the sound it made, the low even beat of a hand-designed engine, and Brock rode off down the mountain entirely insulting that he had just spent 10 inside his own motor. The mans were inside his own motor. It was Loretta Hale who began quietly to set things right, because Loretta had spent 40 years watching the road take people, and had developed a deep intolerance for the small cruelties of the living. She came out and sat down on the bench beside Keanu without a word, and after a while she said, "You going to let that be the end of it?" "It's a video," Keanu said. "It'll be gone by Tuesday. That's not what I'm asking, Eli, and you know it isn't." She looked at him, and she was one of the 4 people alive who called him that, and she had earned the right to say the next thing, which was, Gray would have been off that bench before the bike hit the ground. Not to swing at the kid. You know that's not what I mean. To stand up. You've been sitting on that bench 11 years. I've watched you do it. You come up here, and you fix everybody's machine, and you teach that boy, and you look at that picture on my wall, and you let them downstairs do whatever they want with the thing you built, because being up here is easier than being down there. I loved you both. I'm allowed to say it. You've been hiding in the part of the work that doesn't fight back. Keanu was quiet for a long time. The thing about a true accusation is that there is nothing to say to it, and Loretta did not need him to say anything. She had said it for the both of them and for Gray, and she got up and went back to her griddle and left him with it. And it was true, all of it. And sitting on the bench, he let it be true, instead of doing the thing he had done for 11 years, which was to find the reason it was not his fault. There was always a reason. The board was difficult. The drive was long. His work was here, on the mountain, in the metal, in the boy. Each reason was real, and each reason was a small, comfortable lie. And stacked up over 11 years, they had built him a life in which he got to keep his hands clean and his conscience busy and never once stand in the room where the thing he loved was actually being decided. He had told himself that the workshop was the realest place, that a man who made things was doing more good than a man who argued in a boardroom. And there was a version of that which was true, and a version of that which was just fear wearing the clothes of principle. And he had not, in 11 years, been honest enough with himself to tell which version he was living. Gray would have known. Gray had known, from the hospital bed, well enough to make him promise. The promise had been specific. Be in the room. Don't disappear into the garage and let them sell the soul of it while you keep your hands clean. And Keanu had said yes, and meant it, and then had spent 11 years doing the precise thing Gray had named, with such gentleness and such craftsmanship, and such genuine love, for the work that he had almost never had to notice he was doing it. That is the thing about the failures of good men. They do not look like failures. They look like devotion to something slightly smaller than the thing that actually needed them. He took out his phone. It was an old phone. He had not looked at it much that day, and when he opened it, he found 11 missed calls from a number he half recognized, and a string of messages from a woman named Marisol Vega, who was the chief operating officer of Ironvale Cycle Works, a person he had met exactly twice, and the messages grew in urgency as they went, and the last one said only, "Mr. Reeves, I am driving up the mountain to find you, because no one will answer, and the vote is at 4, and you need to understand what they are voting on. Please. It is everything." He read it twice, and he understood, sitting on the bench with the cold coffee and the wronged motorcycle, that next year had finally arrived. Marisol Vega's car came up the grade at 1:15, too fast for the road, and she got out of it in the dusty lot in clothes that did not belong on that mountain, and looked around at the sea of motorcycles with the particular panic of a person who does not know what the man she is looking for looks like. Because she had met him twice, and both times he had been a quiet, brisk presence at the edge of a room she had assumed was unimportant. She had not slept. She had spent the night before going through the production files, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she was the kind of person who, when a thing she loved was in danger, went and counted exactly what would be lost, and what she had counted was 41 people. She knew their names. She knew that Tomas in the machine shop had a kid with a heart thing, and the insurance that came with the job. She knew that the two Reyes sisters had learned the casting work from their father, who had learned it from his, and that when the work went overseas, the knowledge went with it and did not come back. That you could not buy back a skill once the last hands that held it had gone to do something else. She had tried every official channel to reach the missing founder, the legal department, the old contact numbers, an email address that bounced, and on the third night, sitting alone in the office at 1 in the morning with the list of 41 names in front of her, she had remembered a thing the previous COO had said in passing years ago, that if you ever truly needed Reeves, he rode up the crest to a roadhouse on the weekends, that it was the only place in the world he could reliably be found, and she had written it down on a sticky note and not known why. At 7 that morning, she had taken the sticky note and gotten in her car. "I'm looking for Keanu Reeves," she said, to the lot, to anyone, her voice carrying in the way a frightened voice carries. "Does anyone know Keanu Reeves? I'm told he comes here. And here is a thing about a name. A name is a small machine for changing what people say." The riders in that lot had spent the last hour talking about the old man on the bench and the kid who kicked his bike over. And not one of them had known who the old man was because he had drawn no attention to it, because that was who he was. But Ironvale was a name they knew. Ironvale was a name a good number of them had on their tanks, and a few of them had on their skin. And the name Keanu Reeves, spoken next to the panic of a woman in a suit, asked for him by the founder's name, landed in that lot like a key going into a lock, and people began, slowly, to turn and to look not at Marisol Vega, but at the bench at the edge of the lot, where an old man in a faded jacket was setting down a cup of coffee and getting, without hurry, to his feet. "I'm here," Keanu said. It is hard to describe what went through the lot then, except to say that it moved like a current, person to person, the understanding arriving in waves. The old man whose bike had been kicked over. The unbadged machine the color of winter. The number cast into the case. The name on their tanks. A few of them got it all at once and went pale. A young rider near the front, a woman with the Ironvale mark on the shoulder of her jacket, said, not loudly, almost to herself, "That's the prototype. That's engine number 1. And the sentence traveled, and the crowd that had watched a man be humiliated an hour before began, with the terrible delay of crowds, to understand what they had watched. There is a particular shame that moves through a group of people who realize, together and too late, that they laughed at the wrong moment. It is quieter than the laughter was. It does not announce itself. It shows up as men suddenly very interested in their own boots, as the ones who had filmed the kicked-over bike quietly turning their phones off, as a slow, physical drawing back from the spot where the cruelty had happened, as though cruelty left a mark on the ground you did not want to be standing on. Dolores Aquino, who built the cases and had ridden up that morning with a stone in her chest, had come back into the lot at the sound of the name, and she stood at the edge of the crowd, looking at the old man on the bench she had walked away from an hour before, the man she had told, not knowing, that she wished the missing founder would show up, and her hand had come up over her mouth, because she understood now exactly who she had been talking to, and exactly what she had asked him to do. And Cole Bishop, on the porch, still holding the plates, was looking at the old man who had been teaching him to listen, the quiet man who fixed everyone's machine for free on empty mornings, and understanding for the first time that the thing he wanted to become was sitting 20 feet away in a faded jacket, had been sitting there all along, and had never once said so. Keanu did not look at any of them. He walked to Marisol Vega, and he said, "Tell me what they're voting on." She told him. She told him about Crestline Capital and Spencer Loomis, and the licensing deal, and the overseas manufacturing, and the plan to keep the name and lose the thing the name was for. And she told him that the small shops would close, the 40 or so people who still built each iron veil by hand in California would be let go, that the engine he had designed would be made by the 1,000 out of parts that came from a mold, and that the board had the votes, all but one block, his block, the founder's shares that had not voted in 11 years. "They're counting on you not coming," Marisol said. "Spencer said it in a meeting. He said, 'Men like that never show up. I have been trying to reach you for 3 days. The vote is at 4 o'clock, and it is the soul of the company, and I did not know what else to do, so I got in my car.'" She stopped. She was near tears, and she was not a woman who cried easily, and she said the last of it quietly. "I build the production schedules. I know every one of those 40 people by name. I have a list of them in my bag. I didn't come here for the company. I came here for the list." Keanu looked at her for a moment, and something in his face changed, the way the mountain changes when the light shifts. And what changed it was not anger, and was not fear, but was, after 11 years, the end of an excuse. "I'll come," he said, "not because the vote needs me. Because I made a promise 11 years ago to a man who's on the wall in there, and I've spent 11 years finding reasons not to keep it, and I just had a woman who runs my own company drive up a mountain to ask me to be the man I promised him I'd be. So I'll come, but I'm not going to make it in time to drive there." He looked at the road, the long grade down the mountain, an hour and a half to the basin in a car, and the clock already past 1:30. Not in her car, not on these roads, then how, Marisol said. Keanu looked at the motorcycle the color of a winter sky, the one with beer still drying in its seams, the prototype, the first one, the machine he had built with his own hands, and Gray's 30 years before, and maintained every winter since, the fastest thing he had ever made, and the only thing that could carry one man down the Angeles Crest in time. "On the one they laughed at," he said. "This is the part where I should tell you about the road. Because the road is the reason the next 40 minutes mattered, and because it is a real thing that a real rider would know. The Angeles Crest Highway is one of the great motorcycling roads in the country, and also one of the most unforgiving 66 miles of curves cut into the side of a mountain with very little between the outside lane and a long way down. And to ride it fast is a thing that only a person who has ridden it 1,000 times in every kind of light should ever attempt. And Keanu had ridden it for 30 years. He knew where the decreasing radius turns hid behind the rocks, where the road went damp under the shadow of the north faces, even in summer, where the gravel collected on the apex of the curve above the 11-mile marker. He did not ride it fast because he was reckless. He rode it fast because he was the opposite of reckless, because 30 years had put the road into his hands, the way the engine was in his hands. The difference between recklessness and mastery is that mastery knows exactly how much it is spending. He put on the old helmet that had hung on the bike for years, the one Brock Halsey would have laughed at, and he started the engine, and the low, even beat filled the lot. And the riders, who an hour before had watched him be humiliated now, stood in a kind of silence as the man who had designed the engine in half their motorcycles rolled out of the lot and onto the road, and Cole Bishop stood on the porch with the plates still in his hands and watched the thing he wanted to be ride away down the mountain, to do a thing he did not yet understand. And Loretta Hale stood in the door and said, quietly, to no one, "Go on, Gray. Go on with him." The first 10 miles he rode like a man warming a cold engine, because that is what he was doing. Because you do not ask everything of a machine in the first mile any more than you ask it of a body, and a rider who does not understand that the engine has a temperature and a mood, and a moment when it is ready does not understand the engine at all. He felt it come up to heat under him, through the tank, through the pegs, through the even beat changing its character by a fraction that no instrument would have shown, and that he felt the way you feel a friend relax in a chair beside you. And then, where the road opened above the canyon and the curves began to come, in their long familiar order, he let it go. There is a way of riding a road you have ridden 1,000 times that is not like riding at all. It is like remembering. Keanu did not think about the curves as they came, because thinking is too slow. Thinking is for the curve you have not met yet. He rode the road out of his hands and his hips and the back of his neck, his eyes already 3 turns ahead, reading the road the way he read an engine, by the small tells that the careless never see. He knew the decreasing radius left above the canyon that fooled the visitors every summer, the one that looked like it kept opening, and then suddenly did not, and he was already slowed for it before its trap began. He knew the long shadow under the north face near the 20-mile marker, where the asphalt stayed damp into the afternoon even in August. And he was upright and gentle through the damp and hard on the throttle again, the instant the sun came back. He knew, and this is the one that would have killed a stranger, the loose gravel that collected on the outside side of the apex above the 11-mile marker, washed down by the spring that never fully dried. And he took that curve a foot tighter than the line a map would have given him, on the clean inside, where 30 years had taught him the grip still was. Once, near the bottom, a pickup truck pulled out of a turnout without looking, the way they do, broad across the lane, and a rider who panicked would have grabbed the brake and gone down, and a rider who froze would have hit it. And Keanu did the third thing, the thing that only comes from having met the moment 100 times before in smaller versions, which was to look not at the truck, but at the gap, the narrow, clean line between the truck's bumper and the rock wall. Because a motorcycle goes where the rider looks and nowhere else, and he threaded the gap at a speed that left the driver of the truck sitting in the road with his heart going. For a full minute. And he never touched the brake. And he was gone around the next curve before the dust had settled. He was not being reckless. This is the thing people who do not ride never understand, and it is worth saying because it is the whole difference. Recklessness is spending more than you have. What Keanu did down the Angeles Crest that afternoon was spend, with great precision, exactly what 30 years had given him, and not $1 more. And the proof that he was not being reckless is that he arrived. A reckless man does not arrive. A reckless man is a photograph on Loretta Hale's wall. Keanu had spent his life on the right side of that line, on roads and in workshops, and until 11 years of grief had pulled him off of it, in the boardroom too, and he was spending it there again now, at speed down a mountain, to be in a room by 4 o'clock. He made the basin in 41 minutes. A person who knows the road will tell you that is not possible, and they will be almost right. The boardroom of Iron Vale Cycle Works was on the 4th floor of a building that had been a tractor works in the 1940s. Brick and steel and tall windows. And the board was assembled around a long table at 5 minutes to 4 when the door opened, and an old man in a faded gray jacket and a helmet under his arm walked in with road dust on his boots, and Marcisol Vega behind him, and Spencer Loomis looked up from his papers with the face of a man who has counted the votes 3 times and is seeing walk through the door the one number he did not count. "This is a closed meeting," Spencer Loomis said, but he said it the way you say a thing you already know is not going to work. "I'm a founder," Keanu said. He set the helmet on the table. "I hold 31%. I haven't voted in 11 years. I'd like to vote today." What followed was not dramatic in the way the movies would have it. There was no shouting. There were lawyers, and there was the verifications of the shares, and there was the slow, cold realization going around the table that the recluse had come down off his mountain. And through all of it, Keanu sat quietly with his road dust and his helmet, and said almost nothing, because the strongest thing in that room was not anything he could say. It was the 31%, and the 30 years, and the number cast into the case of the bike parked downstairs, and the simple fact of his presence after 11 years of absence, which told everyone in the room that the thing they had assumed was dead had only been sleeping. It is worth slowing down for the paper trail, because the paper trail is the difference between a story about a feeling and a story about a fact. And this was a story about a fact. A licensing vote of that kind, the kind that moves the manufacture of a patented design, is not decided by who is angriest or who rode the most dramatic distance to be in the room. It is decided by documents, and Marisol Vega had the documents because she had spent 3 sleepless nights assembling them for a fight she did not believe she could win. She laid them on the table one at a time, and she explained each one in the flat, clear voice of a person who has decided that the only weapon she trusts is accuracy. Here was the original design patent, filed in 2 names, one of them sitting at the table, and one of them 11 years dead. Here was the founder's agreement, and here on page 9 was the supermajority clause that Donovan had insisted on at a kitchen table. The clause that made the overseas licensing impossible the moment Keanu's 31% stood against it. Here were the photographs, entered into the record, of the cast mark on the prototype engine downstairs, Z01, and the joined initials, the physical proof that the thing Crestline Capital proposed to send to a factory it had never seen had been made by 2 specific human beings in a rented garage. Spencer Loomis had built his entire deal on the theory that the soul of a company is an abstraction, a sentiment, a thing that can be voted away by people who have never touched it. The documents on the table said otherwise. The soul of the company had a patent number and a clause on page 9 and 30% of the vote, and it had ridden down the Angeles Crest in 41 minutes to sign its name. At 4 o'clock, the board voted, and the licensing deal died. And the 40 people whose names were on the list in Marisol Vega's bag kept their work. And Spencer Loomis closed his folder and sat for a moment with the particular stillness of a man recalculating his entire afternoon. He did not apologize. This is the part the cheap versions get wrong, and it is the part that is truest to how the world actually runs. Spencer Loomis did not have a change of heart at the long table. He gathered his papers, and on his way out he stopped beside Keanu's chair, and what he said was not sorry. It was, "You understand this is a delay, not a victory. The economics don't change because you rode a motorcycle down a hill. Companies like this die. You've bought these people a few years. I hope it was worth the gesture." And he meant it, and he was not entirely wrong, and that is what made him the more frightening kind of antagonist. The kind who is partly right and wholly unmoved, the kind the world is full of, and the kind the stories least like to admit exist. He left the building convinced he had been ambushed by sentiment, and he was never, as far as anyone knows, troubled by it again. The thing about Brock Halsey resolved itself, as these things do now, faster than anyone could control. The clip he had posted, the one of him kicking over the old man's bike, had been climbing all afternoon, doing exactly the cruel numbers he had built his life on. And then somewhere around 5 o'clock, a different clip began to climb past it. One shot by one of the 9 other cameras, the one that showed the rest of it. The old man riding the bike, the hand on the case, the woman in the suit shouting a name across the lot, the slow turning of the crowd. The words, "That's the prototype. That's engine number 1. And then someone connected the name to the brand ambassadorship, to the contract, to the simple devastating fact that Brock Halsey had filmed himself humiliating the man who designed the engine in the motorcycle his sponsor had given him. And the internet did the thing the internet does. And by Monday morning, Iron Veil Cycle Works had quietly ended its ambassadorship. And by Monday afternoon, Brock Halsey had posted a video of himself apologizing that got him mocked worse than anything in his life. Because the apology, like everything else, was performed for the camera, and people can tell. It is worth being fair to him, too, as much as the man allows. Somewhere underneath the character he played there had once been a kid who liked motorcycles for the right reasons, who had wanted, like every one of them, to belong to the thing. And the machine that turned attention into money had taken that kid and taught him, one rewarded clip at a time, that the fastest way to belong was to stand on someone else. He was not born cruel. He was made cruel by a thing that pays for cruelty, which is a different and sadder fact, and a more common one. But he was not changed by what happened to him. That is the part that matters, and the part the satisfying version would lie about. He did not become humble. He became a man who had been caught, which is a smaller and more bitter thing than a man who has understood, and within a week he was looking for a new character to play and a new set of people to be cruel to. because the numbers still rewarded it, and a man will keep being what the numbers reward him for being until something he cannot ignore makes him stop. And being caught, it turns out, is not that thing. Very little is. So the justice was not clean. It never is. The 40 people kept their work, and the deal died, and the promise to Gray was kept, 11 years late. But Spencer Loomis was right about one thing, which was that the economics had not changed, that the slow, careful, handmade way of building things was still a small light in a large dark, that next year there would be another fund and another deal and another vote, and that Keanu was going to have to be in the room for those two now, which is its own kind of sentence for a man who had spent 11 years learning to love the empty road. And Gray was still gone. The deal dying did not bring Gray back. The first thing Keanu did, after the vote, before anything else, was call Loretta Hale at the ridgeline and ask her to take the photograph down off the wall for a minute, the one of the two young men and the bare engine, and hold it up to the phone so he could look at it. And he did not say anything to it, and neither did she. And that is the kind of thing that does not heal and is not supposed to. There was a scratch on the silver tank now, from the gravel, a thin, bright line through the winter sky paint where the bike had gone down. Keanu did not have it repainted, though he could have, though it would have taken an afternoon. He left it. And when Cole Bishop asked him about it, a few weeks later, on a Tuesday evening behind the ridgeline, where Keanu had begun teaching him in earnest now, the real way, the way that takes years, the boy asked the only question that mattered. "You fix everything," Cole said. "Why not the tank?" Keanu ran his thumb along the scratch. His hands were steady on the metal, the way they always were once they were touching the work. "Because the bike didn't do anything wrong," he said. "The kid did the wrong thing. The tank was just there. And if I repaint it, I've got a clean tank, and no record of the day I finally got off the bench. I'd rather keep the record." He set his hand flat on the engine case, over the number, over the joined mark, the way he had in the lot. "Your whole life, people are going to tell you what a thing is worth by how it looks. They looked at this bike and saw junk. They looked at me and saw nobody. They're going to be wrong about that more often than they're right. And the times they're surest are the times they're most wrong. Listen instead of looking. You can't fake the sound of a thing that was built true." He took his hand off the case. "Now, tell me what's wrong with that engine by ear, and don't take a panel off." And Cole Bishop bent over the machine and listened the way he had been taught, and the mountain went dark around them. And somewhere down in the basin, 40 people who would never know his name still had their work because an old man had finally kept a promise. And the boy said, "It's the timing, not the fuel. The timing makes a different kind of wrong." And Keanu, who was 60 years old and the last of something and not, as Alone says, he had let himself believe, did not smile, because the boy had not done it for a smile. He pulled his chair closer, and they kept listening. He had decided some things, on the ride back up the mountain after the vote, that he had not told anyone yet. He was going to go to the meetings now, all of them, for as long as it took, because Spencer Loomis had been right that the fight was not over, and a man does not get to keep a promise once and call it done. And he was going to do the other thing, the thing he had been turning over since Dolores Aquino told a stranger on a bench that she wished the missing founder would show up, which was that the knowledge in the 40 pairs of hands down in the basin was going to go out of the world when those hands did, unless someone made a place for it to go, and that he was the someone, and that he had wasted 11 years not being. There would be an apprenticeship. There would be a program, a real one, where a kid from a town like Coles could get from here to there, could learn to pour a case and true a part and read an engine by ear, and it would not save the dying trade, because dying trades are not saved, but it would keep the light of it alive a little longer in a few more hands. And a little longer was the most anyone had ever been able to do for anything that mattered. He had not told Cole he would, but not tonight. Tonight the boy needed to find the bad timing by ear, and that was the whole of the lessons, and the rest could wait for a Tuesday. I have told this story a few times. and people always want to talk about the ride. The 41 minutes down the Angeles Crest, the recluse coming off the mountain just in time. That was never the part that stayed with me. The part that stayed with me was the hand on the engine case in the parking lot, before any of it, when he had just been humiliated and did not yet know the vote was coming, or that anyone would ever learn who he was. He put his palm flat on the metal and moved his thumb to a number and a pair of joined initials to check that the one irreplaceable thing was still whole. Not the money, not his name. A mark a dead friend had insisted on 30 years before in a garage, both of us or neither of us. He kept the scratch on the tank, and he kept the mark on the case for the same reason, which is that some things you hold on to, not to prove where you came from, but so you do not forget the hands you came up with. He never did get Gray back. Some evenings, on the mountain, that is the only honest thing I know how to say. While this story is fictional, the lessons about what we owe to the hands that build the things we ride are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.